The wind screamed across the Montana Territory like a dying animal, tearing at the canvas sides of the mail coach with frozen claws. Inside, Margaret Chen pressed herself against the wooden seat, her fingers numb despite the worn leather gloves she'd borrowed from the Boston boarding house mistress 3 months ago. The 43 cents in her reticule represented everything she owned in this world. Everything else had been sold, traded, or left behind in the narrow rooms where her mother had dyed coughing blood into rags that Margaret had washed and rewashed until her hands cracked and bled. The coach driver, a weathered man named Hutchins, who smelled of tobacco and unwashed wool, had barely spoken to her during the 3-day journey from the railhead. Now he pulled the horses to a violent stop that sent Margaret sliding forward, her shoulder striking the seat opposite with bruising force. "End of the line," Hutchins announced, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. Margaret peered through the ice-crusted window. Nothing, absolutely nothing but white. White earth, white sky, white air, thick with snow that moved horizontally in the savage wind. No buildings, no town, no sign of human habitation in any direction. "I don't understand," she said, hearing the tremor in her own voice and hating it. "The advertisement said Colfax would meet me in Stillwater Creek. Where is the town?" Hutchins climbed down from the driver's seat with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested every shift in temperature. When he opened the coach door, the wind burst in like an invader, stealing Margaret's breath and bringing tears that froze on her cheeks. "This is Stillwater Creek," Hutchins said flatly. "Or what's left of it. Town died 2 years back when the mining company pulled out. Colfax don't live here. Lives in Helena. Sends mail order brides out here, sees if they're suitable, sends most of them back." He studied her with eyes that had witnessed too much frontier cruelty to register surprise anymore. "Bank don't pay me to haul refuse back east, miss. You'll have to make your own arrangements." Margaret's mind, trained through years of balancing ledgers and tracking numbers that never lied, processed this information with mechanical efficiency. 43 cents would not purchase return passage on the coach, would not in fact purchase much of anything at all. She had sold her mother's silver teapot for $12, the cameo brooch for $8. The 6 books that had been her father's legacy for $2.50. All of it spent on the train fare, the coach fare, the boarding house fees between connections. She had calculated everything down to the last penny, assuming that Hiram Colfax, banker and businessman, who had written such reasonable letters about needing a wife who understood numbers and household management, would at minimum provide shelter while they determined suitability. "Mr. Colfax sent for me specifically," Margaret said, forcing her voice to remain level. "He knows I'm arriving today. He sent money for the passage. He sends for lots of women," Hutchins replied, already hefting her single trunk down from the coach roof. The leather was cracked, the brass fittings tarnished, but it had belonged to her mother and contained everything Margaret owned that hadn't sold for enough to matter. "You're the 5th this year. 3 of them he sent back. One of them," Hutchins paused his expression, suggesting he regretted beginning the sentence, "one of them didn't make it through the winter." He set the trunk in the snow beside the road. Road was perhaps too generous a term. Twin ruts already filling with fresh snow that might have been traveled by wagon once upon a time. "You can't leave me here," Margaret said, and now the tremor in her voice broke into something sharper. Fear, yes, but also anger. The kind of anger that had sustained her through her mother's final illness, through the closure of the textile factory where she'd kept the books for 340 workers, through the sale of every meaningful object in her life. "There's nothing here, no shelter. The temperature must be 20 degrees below freezing." 25 below by my reckoning, Hutchins agreed. He looked at her properly, then perhaps truly seeing her for the first time. Margaret knew what he saw. A woman who stood 6 feet and 2 inches in her stockinged feet, broad-shouldered and strong-boned, with features that combined her Chinese father's angular cheekbones and her Irish mother's wide-set gray eyes into a face that had never been called pretty, but might in certain lights be termed striking. She wore her best-dressed navy wool that she'd sewn herself, with careful attention to the seams that would accommodate her height without looking awkward. Her hair, thick and black with just enough wave from her mother's side, was pinned in a simple chignon beneath a bonnet that had cost more than she'd wanted to spend, but which she justified as necessary for meeting a potential husband. "You got maybe 90 minutes before you freeze solid." Hutchins continued with the matter-of-fact tone of a man delivering a weather report. "There's a homesteader about 6 miles northeast, if you can walk that far in this. But I wouldn't count on it. Snow's already up past your knees and getting deeper." He climbed back onto the driver's seat with the same careful movements. The horses stamped and blew their breath, creating clouds that the wind tore away immediately. "Wait," Margaret called, but her voice was lost in the shriek of the storm. The coach pulled away, wheels cutting through snow that would erase its tracks within minutes. Margaret stood alone on what had once been a road in what had once been a town, in a territory so vast and indifferent that her death would not even register as a statistic worth recording. The cold began its work immediately. It crept through the wool of her dress, through the layers of petticoats, through the chemps and corset that had seemed adequate in Boston but were laughably insufficient here. It stole the feeling from her toes first, then her fingers, then her cheeks. Her lungs burned with each breath, the air so cold it felt like swallowing knives. Margaret had read about hypothermia in a medical text her father had kept on his shelf between the accounting manuals and the poetry. The body's core temperature drops. Confusion sets in. The victim becomes drowsy, stops caring about survival, lies down in the snow, and simply goes to sleep. At the time, sitting in the warm parlor with her mother knitting by the fire, it had seemed almost peaceful. A gentle exit. There was nothing gentle about it. The cold hurt. It hurt with an intensity that made Margaret's previous sufferings seem trivial by comparison. Factory closure, merely an inconvenience, mother's death, a grief that could at least be processed while warm and fed. This was different. This was her body recognizing its imminent termination and screaming in protest. She tried to lift her trunk. The leather handles were already crusted with ice. Even using both hands, she could barely shift it. 6 miles. The homesteader Hutchins had mentioned might as well have been in Boston for all the good it did her. She could not walk 6 miles in knee-deep snow while carrying a trunk, could not walk 6 miles without the trunk, could not survive 90 minutes standing still. The mathematics of the situation arranged themselves in her mind with brutal clarity. No good options, only degrees of bad ones. Margaret abandoned the trunk. The decision came with surprising ease, perhaps because hypothermia was already affecting her judgment. She kept only her reticule tied securely around her wrist, containing the 43 cents and the last letter from Hiram Colfax, promising a new life in Montana Territory. The paper was worthless. The coins might purchase something, though from whom and where remained unclear. She began walking. Northeast Hutchins had said, though Margaret had no compass, and the snow obscured any landmarks that might have provided direction. The sun, wherever it hid behind the storm, gave no guidance. She could only move forward and hope that forward eventually led to something other than more white emptiness. The snow reached past her knees just as Hutchins had predicted. Each step required lifting her leg high, plunging it forward into unmarked drifts that might be 6 inches deep or 3 feet, then dragging the other leg forward to repeat the process. Her skirts grew heavy with accumulated snow and ice. The wind pushed against her like a physical opponent, sometimes gusting so hard she had to stop and brace herself to avoid being knocked down. Time became meaningless. Margaret walked, fell, stood, walked again. Her feet went numb completely, which she understood from her reading was a bad sign. Frostbite, tissue death, amputation, if she somehow survived long enough to reach medical care. She thought about her father dead these 15 years from tuberculosis, contracted in the cramped conditions of Boston's Chinatown, where the only work available to Chinese immigrants involved either laundries or restaurants. He had been an accountant in Guangzhou, her mother had told her, kept books for merchants who traded in silk and tea. But in Boston his credentials meant nothing. His English, though fluent, carried an accent that closed doors. He had died bent over a washboard, his hands cracked and bleeding from the lye soap, his lungs full of the same fluid that would eventually claim Margaret's mother. He had taught Margaret mathematics anyway, taught her to see the beauty in balanced columns in equations that always resolved to truth regardless of the prejudices of the men who might dismiss her abilities. "Numbers don't care about your height," he'd told her when she'd come home crying at age 12, already towering over the boys in her class. Numbers don't care if you're Chinese or Irish or a woman. Numbers simply are. Margaret fell again. This time, getting up required several attempts. Her hands wouldn't close into fists anymore. The cold had stolen that function. She used her forearms to push herself upright, swaying like a drunk, and continued walking in what she hoped was still northeast. A sound cut through the wind, sharp, deliberate, not natural. Margaret stopped listening with the desperate intensity of a drowning person hearing a potential rescuer. The sound came again. 3 cracks in quick succession. Gunfire. Someone was shooting, and not randomly. 3 measured shots spaced for maximum audibility. She tried to shout, but her throat had frozen along with everything else. The sound that emerged was barely a croak. She stumbled forward, changing direction toward where she thought the shots had originated, though the wind made determining direction nearly impossible. More shots. Closer now. 3 again, the same pattern. A signal Margaret's still functioning mind supplied. Someone was firing a signal. "Here," she tried to call. "I'm here." The words were lost instantly, torn away by the wind that had taken everything else. Margaret kept walking, or crawling, or some combination of both. Her body was failing, but her mind still worked, still calculated. 3 shots. Pause. 3 more shots. A deliberate pattern designed to be heard over the storm. Someone was looking for her. Not for her specifically. Couldn't be. No one here knew she existed, except Hutchins, who had driven away without a backward glance. But someone was out in this hell deliberately firing signals into the storm, and that someone represented the only chance Margaret had of seeing another sunrise. She fell into a drift that proved deeper than the others. The snow closed over her head, and for a moment she was in a white tomb, buried alive, the cold crushing her from all sides. Panic gave her strength she didn't know remained. She thrashed upward, breaking through the surface, gasping for air that hurt so badly she almost preferred the suffocation. A shape materialized from the white chaos. Large, moving, Margaret's frozen mind couldn't process details beyond those basics. The shape resolved into a horse, a massive bay with frost in its mane and ice crusting its whiskers. On the horse sat a man. He was very tall. Even hunched against the wind, wrapped in a coat that might have been made from bear hide, he seemed to fill more space than should have been possible. A scarf wrapped around his lower face revealed only ice-colored eyes against weathered skin that fixed on Margaret with an intensity that cut through her hypothermic fog. The man didn't speak. He dismounted in one smooth motion, snow crunching under boots that came up past his knees. He was moving toward her, and Margaret's brain, still trying to catalog and categorize even as her body shut down, registered that he stood even taller than she did. Significantly taller. She would have to look up to meet his eyes if she were standing, which she wasn't anymore because her legs had finally quit cooperating. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. The man lifted her with the kind of ease that suggested her height and weight meant nothing to his strength. He settled her across the saddle, mounted behind her, and wrapped his coat around them both. The sudden relative warmth was so intense it felt like burning. "Can't talk," the man said, his voice rough and deep, muffled by the scarf and wind. "Ride. Now." Margaret wanted to ask who he was, where they were going, whether he knew Hiram Colfax or Stillwater Creek or anything about the situation she'd found herself in. But her jaw wouldn't work properly, and the cold had stolen all her words. She could only lean against the solid warmth of him as the horse began moving, each step deliberate and careful, through snow that would have killed her in another 20 minutes. The ride passed in a blur of white and cold, and the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath them. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, or perhaps merely in and out of awareness. Her body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve the core. She knew this from her reading. Knew that if her core temperature dropped too far, nothing would save her. But wrapped in the bear hide coat that smelled of wood smoke and leather, and something else, something that was just the particular scent of this particular man, she felt her body beginning the slow process of believing it might survive after all. A shape emerged from the storm. Angular, man-made, a cabin built low and solid against the wind with small windows and a chimney from which no smoke rose. The man guided the horse to a small stable attached to the cabin's side, dismounted, and lifted Margaret down with the same casual strength. He carried her through a door that he kicked open rather than trying to manage it with his hands full into darkness that felt warm only by comparison to outside. "Don't move," he commanded, setting her on something soft, a bed Margaret's mind supplied. She was sitting on a bed in a strange cabin with a strange man, and she should probably care about propriety but couldn't seem to summon the energy. She heard him moving around the cabin, the scratch of a match, the flare of lamplight that hurt her eyes, the sound of a fire being built in what must be a stove. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the light, and she took inventory of her surroundings with the same methodical approach she'd used for years when auditing the factory's books. The cabin was single-room, perhaps 20 feet by 15. Rough-hewn log walls chinked with what looked like a mixture of mud and grass. The floor was packed earth. An iron stove in one corner now beginning to radiate heat, and a table with 2 chairs. A narrow bed in the opposite corner, child-sized. The bed she currently occupied, adult-sized with a quilt that showed signs of careful mending. The man had removed his coat and scarf. Margaret catalogued his features with the same detached precision. Easily over 6.5 feet tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested heavy physical labor. Perhaps 40 years old, though the weathering of his face made precise age difficult to determine. Dark hair shot through with gray at the temples, a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his jaw, old and white against tanned skin. Hands that moved with competent efficiency as he fed wood into the stove. He turned those pale blue eyes on her, and Margaret realized she was staring. "Boots," he said. "Off now." It wasn't a request. Margaret tried to reach for her feet, but her hands still wouldn't cooperate properly. The man knelt in front of her without ceremony and began unlacing her boots himself. His movements were quick and impersonal, the touch of someone who had done this before. He pulled off the first boot, and Margaret saw her foot gray-white and lifeless-looking. "Frostbite," the man stated. Not a question. "Bad, but not fatal if we work fast." He removed the second boot and both stockings, then stood and crossed to a basin on the table. He poured water from a pitcher, tested the temperature with his elbow, and brought the basin back to where Margaret sat. "This will hurt," he warned, and lowered her feet into the water. The pain was extraordinary. Margaret had thought the cold hurt, but this was different. Worse, a burning agony that spread from her toes up through her entire body. She bit down on her lip, hard enough to taste blood, determined not to scream. The man watched her feet with clinical attention, occasionally adding water from the pitcher to maintain the temperature. "Fingers next," he said after several minutes that felt like hours. He removed her gloves, and Margaret saw that her fingers had the same gray-white appearance as her toes. He placed her hands in a second basin of tepid water, and the burning started all over again. This time Margaret couldn't entirely suppress the whimper that escaped. "Better to feel it," the man said, his tone not unkind. "Means the tissue's still alive." "Who?" Margaret managed through chattering teeth. "Are you Samuel Bridger?" he replied. "Homesteader. Only person living within 40 miles. He studied her face properly for the first time. "You're the mail-order bride, meant for Colfax." It wasn't a question, but Margaret nodded anyway. "He's not coming," Samuel Bridger said flatly. "Never does. Sends women out, looks at what the coach brings, sends them back if they don't suit." The driver said, Margaret paused, fighting to make her mouth form words properly, said something similar. "Hutchins," Samuel's jaw tightened. "Takes Colfax's money, dumps women in the snow, goes back to Helena. You're the 5th this year." What happened to the others? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his attention fixed on her feet soaking in the basin. 2 went back on the next coach. Cost them everything they had, but they survived. One works as a servant in Helena now. Colfax owns the boarding house, keeps her in debt for room and board. Another pause. The 4th one didn't make it through January. The words settled into the warm cabin like stones dropping into still water. Margaret processed this information, arranging it into columns of credit and debit cost and consequence. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked. Samuel stood, moving to the stove to add more wood. "Homestead Act. 160 acres, if I can prove it up. That means living on it, cultivating 40 acres, staying for 5 years. I'm 3 years in. 2 more, and the land's mine permanent." but you're alone. My wife and son died." The words were delivered in the same flat tone he'd used for everything else, but Margaret heard the weight beneath them. 3 years ago, winter. I was gone hunting. Storm came early. When I got back, they'd frozen. Now I stay on the homestead. Alone." Margaret looked around the cabin again, seeing it differently now. The child's bed in the corner. The 3 plates on the shelf, not 2. The mended quilt that had probably been sewn by hands that would never sew again. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate. Samuel shrugged. "You can't stay here. Not proper. There's a line shack about 2 miles south, but it won't keep you alive through winter. Best option is you wait for the next coach to Helena, 3 weeks from now." "I have 43 cents, Margaret said. "The coach fare to Helena costs more than that." Samuel pulled her feet from the water and examined them critically. The gray-white had shifted to angry red, but the color was returning. "Toes'll be fine. Maybe lose the nail on the big toe, but the tissue's alive." He moved to her hands, checking those as well. "Same story. You'll hurt for a few days, but nothing permanent." "Did you hear what I said?" Margaret asked. "About the money." "Heard you." "So I can't leave in 3 weeks. I can't pay for passage." Samuel stood carrying the basins to the door and dumping the water outside. Cold air rushed in briefly before he closed the door again. "Not my problem." "Then what am I supposed to do?" He turned to look at her fully, and Margaret saw calculation happening behind those pale blue eyes. The same kind of calculation she did herself when confronted with columns that didn't balance, when the numbers told a story that required creative problem-solving. "Can you do math?" he asked abruptly. The question was so unexpected that Margaret blinked. "Yes. I was head accountant at a textile factory in Boston. 340 employees, managed payroll, supply, purchasing, client invoicing, tax preparation." Samuel crossed to a shelf and pulled down a stack of papers. He brought them to the table and spread them out. Margaret, her feet still too tender to walk properly, couldn't see the details from where she sat. "Come here," Samuel said. Margaret stood carefully, testing her weight on her damaged feet. The pain was considerable, but manageable. She limped to the table and looked down at what Samuel had spread before her. Ledgers, or what were attempting to be ledgers. 3 years' worth of records tracking seed purchases, crop sales equipment costs, and what looked like property tax assessments. The handwriting was neat enough, but the organization was chaotic. Dates out of sequence, calculations that didn't add up. Line items that referenced previous entries without clear notation. "This is," Margaret began, then stopped herself. Insulting his bookkeeping wouldn't help her situation. "It's a mess," Samuel finished for her. "I know, my wife kept the books before. She had a system. I don't. I plant wheat, I harvest wheat, I sell wheat. The numbers are supposed to track what I owe and what's owed to me, but I can't make sense of it anymore." Margaret ran her finger down one column, her professional instincts immediately cataloging errors. "This calculation for the seed purchase is wrong. You've been overcharged by," she paused, adding numbers in her head, 18%. 18% over 3 years on seed alone comes to more mental calculation, approximately $96. Samuel leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Can you prove that? Give me an hour with these records and I can give you a complete accounting of where you're being overcharged, where you're losing money due to poor timing on sales, and where you could increase profit through better market awareness." 1 hour, possibly 2 if the records go back further than what I'm seeing here. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. Finally he said, "I need someone who can manage the books, keep track of seed fertilizer equipment depreciation, monitor the Chicago grain prices and time the sales, handle the tax assessments from the territorial government, calculate what I'll need for next year's planting based on projected yield." "That's a significant amount of work," Margaret observed. $25 a month, Samuel said, plus room and board. There's a cabin about 200 yards from here. Needs some repair, but it's sound. You'd have your own space, privacy. This arrangement would be purely professional." Margaret's mind worked quickly, calculating. $25 a month. In 3 weeks the coach would return, but she'd have earned approximately $18 by then, still not enough for passage. But in 2 months she'd have $50. enough to get back to Boston and perhaps have something left over to restart her life there. Except Boston held nothing for her anymore. The factory was closed. Her mother was dead. The boarding house where she'd lived would have rented her room to someone else by now. The women she'd worked with at the factory would have scattered, looking for work in other cities, other factories. "Why would you offer this to me?" Margaret asked. "You don't know me. I could be incompetent, dishonest." "Could be," Samuel agreed. "But you're educated, you claim expertise in accounting, and you're desperate enough that you won't have better options. That last part matters. Someone desperate is someone who'll work hard to prove their worth." It was cold logic, but Margaret couldn't fault it. She was desperate. And she did have expertise that could be valuable. The question was whether she trusted this man, this stranger who lived alone in a cabin that still held the ghosts of his dead family. "The cabin you mentioned," Margaret said. "How far did you say it was?" 200 yards, south side. Used to be storage, but we'd started fixing it up before—" He stopped the sentence hanging unfinished. "Before his wife and son died. Before he'd become a man who lived alone and saved mail-order brides from freezing in blizzards." "I'd like to see it," Margaret said. "Before I decide." Samuel nodded. He fetched her boots, which had been drying near the stove, and helped her put them on. Her feet protested, but the leather had warmed and softened. He handed her the bear hide coat and wrapped his own wool coat around himself, then led her outside. The storm had lessened slightly. Snow still fell, but the wind had dropped to something merely bitter rather than lethal. Samuel walked with long strides that Margaret had to work to match her feet still tender through snow that came up past her calves. The cabin he'd mentioned appeared after about a minute of walking. It was smaller than his own dwelling, perhaps 12 feet by 10. The logs were sound, the chinking intact. Samuel pushed open the door, and the interior smelled of old hay and mouse droppings, but nothing worse. There was a small window currently shuttered. A stone fireplace that looked functional, rough wooden floor rather than packed earth. "I'd need to bring over a bed," Samuel said. "Some furniture. The stove from my place, I'd get a new one. We'd need to clean this thoroughly." But it's sound, wind-tight, safe. Margaret turned slowly, taking inventory. It was small, but it was hers, or could be hers. A space where she wouldn't have to fold herself smaller, wouldn't have to apologize for her height or her heritage or her unfeminine expertise with numbers. "And the work," she asked. "You said bookkeeping, market monitoring, tax preparation. What else?" "That's it," Samuel said. "I'm not looking for a cook or a housekeeper. I manage that myself. I need someone who can make sense of the business side. Someone who can tell me if I'm being cheated, if I'm timing sales wrong, if I'm missing opportunities." "What about Hiram Colfax?" Margaret asked. "Won't he object to me staying here?" Samuel's expression hardened. "Colfax owns the bank in Helena, holds the mortgage on most of the homesteads in this territory, including mine. But he doesn't own me, and he doesn't dictate who I hire." He paused. "Though he'll likely try to make trouble. He usually does when his mail-order arrangements don't work out the way he planned." "What kind of trouble?" "Legal kind, probably. He's got lawyers. Might claim you're contracted to him, might try to collect debt for the coach fare. Might find some other angle." Samuel looked at her directly. "You take this job, you're taking on his displeasure, along with it. Worth knowing that up front." Margaret thought about the 43 cents in her reticule. About Boston with its closed factories and rented rooms she could no longer afford. About the 5 mail-order brides Hiram Colfax had sent for and discarded like defective merchandise. "I'll take the job," she said. $25 a month, room and board professional arrangement only." Samuel extended his hand, and Margaret shook it. His grip was firm and warm and calloused from years of physical labor. "I'll bring supplies over tomorrow. Start cleaning this place out. You can stay in my cabin tonight. I'll sleep in the barn with the horse." "That's not necessary," Margaret protested. "It's proper," Samuel said flatly. "People talk even out here. Bad enough you're working for an unmarried man. Worse if you're sleeping under his roof." They walked back through the snow to Samuel's cabin. He built up the fire in the stove and showed Margaret where the food supplies were kept. Salt pork, dried beans, flour, a bit of coffee. Simple provisions for a simple life. "I'll be back at dawn," Samuel said, pulling on his coat. "Help yourself to whatever you need. There's a bar for the door. Use it." He left without further ceremony, the door closing behind him with solid finality. Margaret stood alone in the cabin of a dead woman, wearing a dress soaked through with melted snow, her feet aching, and her future uncertain. She moved to the shelf where Samuel kept his ledgers and pulled down the stack of papers he'd shown her earlier. Professional curiosity, she told herself, just getting a sense of what needed to be done. But as she spread the documents across the table and began sorting them by date, as her trained eye caught errors and inconsistencies that would have made her wince back at the factory, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. Purpose. The numbers didn't care that she was too tall, didn't care that her father had been Chinese or her mother Irish, didn't care that 5 men had broken engagements when they'd met her in person and seen that she stood taller than they did. Numbers simply were. And Margaret knew how to make them tell the truth. She worked through the night, occasionally adding wood to the stove, her damaged feet propped on the second chair. By the time pale light began filtering through the small window, she had reorganized 3 years of chaotic records into clear categories. Seed purchases, equipment costs, harvest yields, sale prices and dates, property taxes, transportation fees. The picture that emerged was troubling. Samuel Bridger was being systematically overcharged by nearly every merchant he dealt with, not dramatically enough to be obvious, but consistently enough that it added up. The seed dealer charged 18% over fair market value. The equipment supplier added mysterious surcharges that appeared nowhere in the written agreements. The grain buyer in Helena paid 15% below the Chicago market price and did so on the least favorable dates. Over 3 years, these overcharges totaled $380. More than a year's worth of profit siphoned away through numbers that Samuel either couldn't read or couldn't interpret. Margaret heard boots on the wooden steps outside. She stood wincing as her feet protested and moved to open the door. Samuel stood on the threshold carrying a bucket of what appeared to be snow for melting into wash water. He looked past her to the table where she'd spread out his records, now sorted into neat stacks with handwritten notes explaining each category. "You said an hour," he observed. "Maybe 2. "I couldn't sleep," Margaret admitted, "and the work needed doing." Samuel set down the bucket and moved to the table. He picked up the top sheet from one stack, a summary Margaret had written detailing the seed overcharges. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he processed the numbers. $380, he said finally. "Over 3 years. "That I can prove with documentation," Margaret confirmed. "There may be more that I haven't found yet." "Your wife's system," she hesitated, not wanting to criticize a dead woman, "was organized according to a logic I haven't fully deciphered. But based on what I can verify, yes, $380 minimum." Samuel set the paper down carefully. "That would have been enough to buy a new plow, upgrade the seed drill, maybe hire help during harvest." "Or save for emergencies," Margaret added quietly. Samuel looked at her and Margaret saw understanding pass between them. $380 might have been enough to buy extra food stores before a harsh winter. Might have been enough to make the difference between survival and death when a storm came early and a man was away hunting. "I'll make breakfast," Samuel said, moving toward the stove. "Then we'll go into Helena, file complaints with the Territorial Commerce Board about the overcharges, and," he paused, his back to her, "we'll need to register you as my employee officially. Make it legal before Colfax tries to make trouble." "You think he will?" "I know he will," Samuel replied. "Man like Colfax doesn't like losing control. You were supposed to be his to accept or reject. Now you're working for me instead. He'll see that as theft." "I'm not property to be stolen," Margaret said sharply. Samuel turned to look at her. A flicker of respect crossed his weathered features. "No," he agreed. "You're not. But the law doesn't always see things clearly where women are concerned. Better to have everything documented properly before Colfax's lawyers start sniffing around." He prepared a simple breakfast of fried salt pork and johnny cakes made from cornmeal. They ate in silence, Margaret too tired to make conversation, and Samuel apparently not inclined toward unnecessary words. But the silence was companionable rather than awkward. The quiet of two people who understood that sometimes work mattered more than talk. After breakfast, Samuel hitched his horse to a small wagon that had been stored in the barn. He helped Margaret up to the seat, her feet still protesting any movement, and they began the long drive to Helena. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a landscape of white so brilliant it hurt to look at directly. The cold remained brutal, but the wind had died to occasional gusts that sent snow devils spinning across the frozen ground. "How far to Helena?" Margaret asked. 40 miles, Samuel replied. "We'll make it by evening if the road stays clear." 40 miles. The same distance that separated this homestead from any meaningful civilization, the same isolation that had killed Samuel's wife and son. Margaret understood now why he lived alone, why he'd stayed on this land that held such painful memories. The Homestead Act required 5 years of continuous residence and cultivation. Leaving meant forfeiting everything. Starting over somewhere else meant abandoning the only thing Samuel had left of the life he'd tried to build. They rode in silence for the first hour. Then Samuel said without preamble, "You'll need warmer clothes. What you're wearing won't survive Montana winter." "I have one other dress," Margaret replied, "and a coat that's serviceable." "Not good enough. We'll stop at the Mercantile in Helena, get you proper winter gear, wool pants if you're willing, canvas coat lined with sheepskin, boots rated for 40 below." "I can't afford that," Margaret protested. "Take it out of your wages," Samuel said, "or consider it a business expense. Can't have my accountant freezing to death before she finishes straightening out my books." There was the faintest hint of humor in his voice. Margaret glanced at him and saw what might have been the ghost of a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Accountant," she repeated. "I like the sound of that. Better than mail-order bride." "Significantly better," Margaret agreed. They reached Helena as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if Margaret hadn't been too cold and exhausted to appreciate them. The territorial capital was larger than she'd expected, with actual streets and brick buildings and the kind of civilization that seemed impossible after days of seeing nothing but white emptiness. Samuel drove directly to a building that proclaimed itself to be the Territorial Commerce Office. Inside, a clerk who looked barely old enough to shave sat behind a desk covered with papers and ink stains. "Help you?" the clerk asked, not looking up from whatever he was writing. "Need to register an employee," Samuel said. "Official capacity." That got the clerk's attention. He looked up first at Samuel, then at Margaret, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her height. "Employee," the clerk repeated. "What kind of work?" "Accounting and business management," Samuel replied, "for my homestead operation." The clerk pulled out a form and began filling it in with practiced efficiency. Name, age, place of origin, nature of employment, compensation terms. He had Samuel and Margaret both sign at the bottom, witnessed the signatures himself, and stamped the document with official-looking seal. "That'll be $2 filing fee," the clerk said. Samuel paid from a small leather pouch that he kept in his coat pocket. The clerk gave him a copy of the registered document, and the transaction was complete. "One more stop," Samuel said as they left the office. "Bank." Margaret's stomach tightened. "Colfax's bank. Only bank in Helena," Samuel confirmed. "But we're not there to see him. Need to file the overcharge complaints officially. Documentation for the Territorial Review Board." The bank was impressive, 3 stories of brick with brass fittings that gleamed even in the fading light. Inside, polished wood counters and tellers in neat suits created an atmosphere of prosperity and permanence. Behind a glass-walled office at the back, Margaret could see a man who matched the description from Hiram Colfax's letters. Average height, thinning hair, expensive suit. He was speaking with someone Margaret couldn't see from her angle. Samuel approached one of the tellers and presented the evidence Margaret had compiled. The teller, a young man with nervous hands, looked increasingly uncomfortable as he read through the documentation. "These are serious accusations," the teller said quietly. "Mr. Henderson, at the seed company, he's been doing business in Helena for 20 years. 20 years of overcharging, apparently," Samuel replied. "The numbers don't lie." "I'll need to show this to Mr. Colfax," the teller said. "He'll want to review it personally before we file anything with the Territorial Board." "Fine," Samuel said. "We'll wait." The teller disappeared into the glass office. Through the window, Margaret watched him present the documents to Hiram Colfax. She saw Colfax's expression change from mild interest to something harder as he read. His eyes lifted from the papers and found her through the glass. His gaze was cold and calculating, and Margaret felt her spine straighten instinctively, refusing to be diminished by a man she'd never even met. Colfax stood and walked out of his office with the unhurried pace of someone who owned the building and knew it. He stopped in front of Samuel and Margaret, the documents held in one manicured hand. "Mr. Bridger," Colfax said pleasantly, "I see you've brought my mail-order bride to visit." "Miss Chen is my employee," Samuel said flatly. "Registered with the territorial office as of this afternoon. Here on business regarding merchant overcharges." Colfax's smile never wavered, but his eyes went even colder. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Chen traveled to Montana Territory under a contractual arrangement with me. She owes $47 for coach fare and associated expenses. Until that debt is satisfied, she's not free to enter other employment." "Show me the contract," Margaret said. Colfax turned his attention to her fully for the first time. His gaze traveled from her face down to her feet and back up again in a deliberate assessment that made her skin crawl. "The contract is implied by the terms of mail order arrangement," Colfax replied smoothly. "Montana territorial law recognizes such agreements as binding. I paid for your passage. You are therefore obligated to me until such time as either a formal marriage is contracted or the debt is repaid with interest." "What interest rate?" Margaret asked. "Standard commercial rate, 8% per annum." "Calculated how simple or compound?" Colfax's smile thinned slightly. "I don't see how that's relevant." "It's extremely relevant if you're claiming legal debt," Margaret replied. She felt Samuel's presence solid and steady beside her, giving her courage to press forward. Under territorial law, any debt claimed must have clear terms established in writing prior to expenditure. I never signed any agreement. I never received any documentation of terms. Therefore, no legal debt exists. "The expenditure was made in good faith," Colfax countered. "Good faith doesn't create legal obligation without mutual consent," Margaret said. "If it did, you could claim I owed you for the air I breathed while riding in a coach you paid for." Several of the bank employees had stopped working to watch the exchange. Colfax noticed, and his expression hardened further. "This is neither the time nor the place for legal debate," he said. "Miss Chen, I suggest you consult with proper legal counsel before making claims about territorial law you clearly don't understand." "I understand numbers," Margaret replied. "And the numbers say you've been systematically overcharging homesteaders through your business associates for years. Mr. Bridger's case is merely the first I've documented. I imagine there are others." The temperature in the bank seemed to drop 10 degrees. Colfax looked at Samuel with open hostility now. "You'd do well to control your employee Bridger," Colfax said quietly. "Making accusations against respected businessmen can have consequences." "Only accusations I'm making are backed by documentation," Samuel replied, "which your teller has right there in his hands. You want to file them with the territorial board, or should I take them to the marshal's office instead?" For a long moment, Margaret thought Colfax might refuse outright. But then he glanced around at his employees, all of whom were now definitely listening, and seemed to recalculate his approach. "I'll review these personally," Colfax said, taking the documents from his nervous teller. "If there are genuine errors, they'll be corrected. But understand, Bridger, that business relationships in Helena are built on trust. Undermining that trust can make future transactions difficult, very difficult." It was a threat barely dressed in civilized language. Samuel seemed unmoved. "Appreciate your time," Samuel said. "We'll expect to hear about the findings within 2 weeks." He turned and walked toward the door. Margaret followed, feeling Colfax's gaze boring into her back with every step. Outside, the cold air felt cleaner somehow, as if the bank had been contaminated by more than just financial corruption. "He's going to make trouble," Margaret said. "Yes," Samuel agreed. "But we documented everything properly. He can't claim illegal debt without proof of contract. Can't suppress the overcharge complaint without looking guilty. Best he can do is make things difficult through other channels." "What other channels?" Samuel helped her up into the wagon. "We'll find out soon enough." They made one more stop at the Mercantile, where Samuel outfitted Margaret with proper Montana winter gear. Wool pants that shocked the shop clerk, but which Samuel insisted were necessary. Canvas coat lined with sheepskin, boots rated for brutal temperatures, thick gloves, and a scarf that wrapped around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed. The total came to $34. Margaret tried to protest, but Samuel paid without discussion. "Take it from my wages," Margaret said as they loaded the supplies into the wagon. "We'll settle accounts monthly," Samuel replied. "Right now you need to survive your first Montana winter. The clothes are an investment in making sure that happens." They began the long drive back to the homestead as full darkness fell. The temperature dropped to bone-cracking cold, and Margaret was grateful for the new coat, even though it smelled of lanolin and unfamiliar animals. Above them, stars appeared in such profusion that Margaret, accustomed to Boston's light, polluted skies, could only stare in wonder. "Never seen the stars like this before," she said. "Nothing between you and them out here," Samuel replied. "No city lights, no smoke, just you and the sky and the cold." "It's beautiful," Margaret said, in a terrible sort of way. Samuel glanced at her, and in the starlight she saw something shift in his expression. "Yes," he agreed quietly, "it is." They reached the homestead near midnight. Samuel helped Margaret down from the wagon and carried her new supplies to the small cabin they'd looked at that morning. It was still dirty, still smelled of mice, but in the darkness it seemed almost welcoming. A space that was hers. A space where she could stand at her full height without apology. "I'll bring over furniture tomorrow," Samuel said. "Get the stove installed. For tonight you're back in my cabin. I'll take the barn again, Mr. Bridger." Margaret began, then stopped. She wanted to thank him, but the words seemed inadequate. He'd saved her life, given her employment, stood beside her against a man who clearly had both power and willingness to use it. "How did you thank someone for that? Call me Sam," he said. "If we're going to be working together, might as well use first names." "Sam?" Margaret repeated. "I'm Margaret, or Maggie, if you prefer." "Maggie," Sam said, testing the name. He nodded. "Suits you better than Margaret." He left her at the door of his cabin with instructions to bar it from the inside. Maggie went through the same routine as the night before, built up the fire, made herself tea from the precious coffee supply, rationing it carefully, examined her feet, which were still tender but showed no signs of serious damage. Then she returned to the ledgers spread across the table and continued her work, because the numbers still needed to balance. The errors still needed to be corrected. And somewhere in Helena, Hiram Colfax was almost certainly planning his next move. But for the first time since her mother's death, Maggie Chen felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. She had work that mattered, skills that were valued, a place to sleep that didn't require her to fold herself into someone else's expectations. Outside, the Montana winter pressed against the cabin walls with crushing force. But inside, warmed by the fire and surrounded by numbers that were finally beginning to tell their true story, Maggie was exactly where she needed to be. She was home. Dawn came late to Montana in December, the sun struggling to lift itself above the eastern mountains like a man hauling himself out of a frozen river. Maggie woke to find frost coating the inside of the cabin windows in patterns that looked like ferns carved from ice. Her breath misted in the air despite the embers still glowing in the stove. She added wood quickly, her movements efficient from a childhood spent managing coal fires in a Boston tenement where heat was precious and fuel expensive. Outside, she heard the rhythmic sound of an axe biting into wood. She dressed in layers, grateful now for the wool pants Sam had insisted on purchasing. They were scandalous by Boston standards, but eminently practical when the temperature hovered somewhere around 20 below zero. Over the pants, she wore her navy dress, shortened now to a more practical length that wouldn't drag in the snow. The new boots came up past her calves and laced tight enough to keep out moisture. When she opened the cabin door, she found Sam had already been working for what must have been hours. A substantial pile of split firewood stood near the smaller cabin, and he was in the process of carrying furniture across the snow-packed path. A narrow bed frame, a table that looked handmade but sturdy, two chairs that didn't match but both appeared sound. "Morning," Sam said without breaking his rhythm. He set down the chairs and headed back toward his cabin for another load. "You should have woken me," Maggie protested. "I could have helped." "You're still recovering from frostbite," Sam replied. "And I've been moving furniture since before you were born. Don't need help." But Maggie followed him anyway, carrying smaller items: a basin for washing, a lamp with a cracked glass shade that still functioned, a small mirror that must have belonged to Sam's wife, its frame carved with delicate flowers that spoke of care and time invested in beauty even on the frontier. By mid-morning, they had the small cabin furnished with the basics. Sam installed the stove, a newer model that he'd apparently purchased in Helena specifically for this purpose, and got a fire burning hot enough to drive the worst of the cold from the single room. Maggie swept the floor with a broom made from bound twigs, then went over it again with a wet cloth, scrubbing away years of accumulated dirt and mouse droppings. "Needs a proper cleaning still," she observed, surveying the results with the critical eye of someone who'd spent years managing a household on limited resources. "But it's livable." "Livable is a start," Sam agreed. He was examining the window frame, checking for gaps that would let in cold air. "I'll bring over some rags to pack around the edges here, and you'll need bedding. Got extra quilts at my place." "You've already spent too much," Maggie said. "The clothes, the furniture, now bedding. I'm in debt to you before I've done any work worth paying for." Sam turned to look at her, his pale blue eyes serious. "The way I figure it, you've already saved me $380 I didn't know I was losing. That pays for a few quilts and some second-hand furniture." He paused, then added, "Besides, investment in my accountant is investment in my business. Can't have you freezing or working in conditions that aren't fit." "Accountant," Maggie repeated, savoring the word the same way she had in the wagon yesterday. It felt more substantial than any title she'd held before. At the factory, she'd been head bookkeeper, which sounded important but carried no real authority. Here on this isolated homestead, she was the only person for 40 miles who could make sense of the numbers that determined survival or failure. "Come on," Sam said. "Want to show you the operation? Oh, you can't manage books if you don't understand what you're tracking." He led her out past the barn to where the land opened up into rolling fields that in summer would presumably be covered with wheat. Now they were buried under snow, the terrain marked only by fence posts that poked up like fingers pointing accusingly at the sky. Sam walked along the fence line, Maggie beside him, their boots crunching in the frozen crust. 160 acres total, Sam explained. Homestead Act requires cultivating 40 of it. I've got 52 under production. Wheat, mostly some oats for the horses. Soil's good when there's enough rain, which there isn't always. He gestured toward a section where the fence line curved. That's where the irrigation would go if I could afford it. Channel from the creek-controlled gates. Would increase yield by maybe 30%. How much would irrigation cost? Maggie asked, her mind already calculating. Equipment and labor. Maybe $200. But I don't have $200. What I have is debt to Colfax's bank and enough margin to survive year to year if the weather cooperates and the grain prices hold. They walked further, Sam pointing out the sections where he'd planted different varieties of wheat, explaining the rotation schedule he used to keep the soil healthy, describing the challenges of the short growing season and the constant threat of early frost or hail that could destroy months of work in minutes. Maggie listened and observed and mentally cataloged everything. The fence that needed repair in the northwest section, the barn roof that showed signs of sagging under snow weight, the equipment shed that held a seed drill, a harrow, and a plow that Sam had clearly maintained with obsessive care, but which were nevertheless aging past their prime functionality. "The seed drill," Maggie said. "How old? Bought it 7 years ago, before Anna and Jesse died. Cost $80, then probably cost twice that now. And how long does equipment like that typically last?" Sam shrugged. "Depends on maintenance and usage. This one's got maybe 3 more seasons before something critical breaks and it's not worth repairing." Maggie filed that information away. 3 years. Which meant she needed to be factoring in replacement cost saving incrementally, so that when the seed drill finally failed, Sam wouldn't be facing a crisis that could destroy the entire operation. They returned to the main cabin where Sam had laid out 3 years' worth of correspondence with grain buyers, equipment suppliers, and the Territorial Tax Office. Maggie spread the letters across the table, organizing them by sender and date, her trained eye catching patterns that Sam would never have noticed. "Your grain buyer in Helena," Maggie said, holding up a series of letters. "He's been paying you 15% below Chicago market price, consistently, for 3 years. "Chicago's a long way from Montana," Sam replied. "Transportation costs eat into the price. Transportation from Montana wheat fields to Helena is maybe 50 miles. Transportation from Helena to Chicago is over 1,000 miles by rail. Yet he's charging you as if you're responsible for the full distance." Maggie pulled out another letter. "And look here, he's dating his purchases according to when he receives the wheat, not when you deliver it. That lets him claim whatever price was current on his received date, which is always lower than the date you actually brought the grain in." Sam leaned over the table, reading the letters more carefully. "Son of a bitch," he said quietly. "It gets worse," Maggie continued. "He's part owner in the transportation company he uses to ship wheat to Chicago, so he's profiting twice. Once by underpaying you, once by overcharging himself on paper for transportation costs that he then uses to justify the low purchase price. Can you prove that, given access to territorial business registration records? Yes. It'll take time, but the pattern is clear enough that a territorial commerce investigator would find it easily once they knew where to look." Sam sat down heavily in one of the mismatched chairs. "I trusted him, Ben Carter, known him 5 years. He came to Anna's funeral, brought food, told me if I ever needed anything to just ask." "People who steal from you often make the best friends first," Maggie said quietly. "It's easier to rob someone who trusts you." They spent the rest of the morning going through every document Sam had kept, and Maggie began to see the full scope of what had been done to him. Not just carelessness or unfortunate business dealings. Systematic exploitation by people who knew that a widower struggling alone on an isolated homestead wouldn't have the time or expertise to catch their schemes. The seed supplier sold Sam varieties that were marked up 18%, and which, according to the agricultural reports Maggie found referenced in other correspondence, were inferior strains that would naturally produce lower yields. The equipment maintenance company charged for repairs that either weren't necessary or weren't performed. The territorial tax assessor had Sam's acreage listed incorrectly, resulting in higher property taxes than legally owed. It was death by 1,000 small cuts. Each individual overcharge or unnecessary expense seemed almost trivial. But accumulated over 3 years, they represented the difference between a homestead that could thrive and one that merely survived year to year with no hope of improvement. "How much total?" Sam asked when Maggie finally set down her pen after hours of calculations. $637, Maggie replied. "That I can document with certainty. There's probably more that I can't prove because the records don't go back far enough or were never kept properly." $637, more than 2 years of profit for a homestead this size, enough to have purchased irrigation equipment, upgraded the aging seed drill, hired seasonal labor during harvest, built reserves against bad years. Enough to have made the difference when a storm came early and food ran short. Sam stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered fields. Maggie watched his back, saw the tension in his shoulders, and understood that this wasn't just about money. It was about trust betrayed, about men who'd smiled and shaken his hand while robbing him, about the possibility that better bookkeeping might have meant Anna and Jesse had food enough to survive that winter 3 years ago. "We file complaints with the Territorial Commerce Board," Maggie said quietly. "Document everything submitted officially. The law requires investigation of documented fraud. It's slow, but it's thorough." "And in the meantime, these men keep operating," Sam said without turning around. "Keep cheating other homesteaders who don't have accountants to catch them." "Yes," Maggie admitted. "That's how the system works. Documentation, investigation, legal proceedings. It takes time." Sam turned to face her. "What if we went to them directly, confronted them with the evidence, demanded restitution? They'd deny everything and likely destroy any records that might prove guilt," Maggie replied. "And then we'd have no case at all. So we just file papers and wait and hope the territorial government actually cares enough to act. Unless you have a better idea, yes." Sam was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What if we could prove the connections between the grain buyer and the transportation company? Between Colfax's bank and the suppliers who are overcharging? Show it's not isolated incidents, but organized fraud. That would require access to business registration records, Bank documents, shipping manifests, Maggie said. We can request some of that through official channels, but anything that might be incriminating will be buried or hidden. Helena's not that big a town, Sam said slowly. People talk. Clerks see things. Maybe we don't need official access. Maybe we just need to ask the right questions to the right people. Maggie felt something shift in her chest, a kind of excitement she hadn't experienced since her factory days when she'd caught a supplier padding invoices and managed to save the company $200 by threatening to expose the fraud. This was bigger, more complex, and potentially more dangerous if Hiram Colfax and his associates realized what she was doing. It would take time, Maggie said, and we'd need to be careful. If Colfax thinks we're building a case against him, he'll move to protect himself. How long? Maggie considered the scope of what would be required. Cross-referencing business registrations with ownership records, tracking shipping patterns to prove the transportation company was owned by the grain buyer, finding witnesses among clerks or other homesteaders who'd been similarly cheated, building a case solid enough that the territorial government couldn't ignore it. 2 months, she said finally, maybe 3 if we're thorough. That takes us to spring, Sam observed. Planting season. I'll be too busy to help much. I don't need help, Maggie replied. I need access to records and permission to ask questions on your behalf. The rest is just bookkeeping on a larger scale. Sam studied her with that pale blue gaze that seemed to see more than most people noticed. You really think you can do this? Build a case strong enough to take down men who've been operating this scheme for years? Numbers don't lie, Maggie said. And men who steal through numbers always leave traces. They can't help it. They have to record transactions somewhere or the fraud doesn't profit them. My job is finding those records and making them tell the truth. All right, Sam said, but we do this smart. You don't confront anyone directly. You don't let on what you're investigating. You're just a new accountant getting familiar with local business practices, asking questions any competent bookkeeper would ask. Agreed, Maggie said. They shook hands on it, a formal gesture that felt like sealing a contract more binding than any paper document. Then Sam stood and stretched his height, requiring him to duck slightly to avoid the ceiling beams. Getting late, he observed. You should settle into your cabin. I'll bring over supper in an hour or so. Nothing fancy, but it'll be hot. After Sam left, Maggie walked the short distance to her new home. The small cabin was warm now from the stove that had been burning all day. She'd left the window shutters open, and late afternoon sun streamed through the wavy glass, creating patterns on the rough wooden floor. She unpacked her few belongings, the extra dress carefully folded. Her mother's hairbrush, the bristles worn but still functional. A small daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, both young and hopeful and unaware of how hard their lives would become. A notebook that had belonged to her father filled with accounting exercises he'd used to teach her mathematics when she was barely old enough to hold a pen. Maggie set the daguerreotype on the table where she could see it while working. Her father stared out from the image with serious eyes that she'd inherited. Her mother smiled slightly, the Irish beauty that had attracted a Chinese immigrant despite the scandal it would cause in both their communities. I'm an accountant now, Maggie told the image quietly, working for a homesteader in Montana Territory. It's not what you planned for me, but I think you'd understand. Her father had taught her that dignity came from competence, that respect had to be earned through skill rather than inherited through birth or gender. Her mother had taught her that survival sometimes required accepting help, but never required accepting humiliation. Together, they'd given her tools to navigate a world that didn't make space for women who stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and had accounting expertise that threatened men who preferred their women decorative rather than competent. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sam stood outside holding a covered pot that steamed in the cold air. "Stew?" he said. "Venison, potatoes, carrots. Nothing special, but there's plenty." He came inside and set the pot on the stove to keep warm. Maggie got out the 2 bowls and spoons she'd brought from Sam's cabin, and they served themselves in quiet understanding. The stew was simple but well-made, the kind of food that prioritized nutrition over presentation. They ate at the small table, the evening light fading outside as the sun dropped behind the western mountains. "Tell me about your wife," Maggie said, then immediately regretted the question when she saw Sam's expression close like a door slamming shut. But after a long moment he said, "Anna, from Wisconsin originally, came west with her parents who were looking for farmland. I met her at a church social in Helena. She was tall for a woman, 5'10", smart. Could calculate planting schedules in her head faster than I could do them on paper." He paused, staring into his bowl. "She understood the land, understood what it took to make a homestead work. We built this place together, every fence post, every cleared acre." "How long were you married?" 7 years. Jesse was born in year 3. Perfect little boy. Had Anna's eyes and my stubborn streak." Sam set down his spoon, the food apparently forgotten. "Winter of '80. I went hunting because we were short on meat stores. Planned to be gone 3 days. Storm came in on day 2, worse than anything I'd seen before. Tried to get back, but the snow was so deep the horses couldn't move. Took me 5 days to make it home." He stopped talking, and Maggie waited, understanding that some stories required time to tell. "They were in the bed," Sam continued finally. "Anna and Jesse both. She'd wrapped him in every blanket we owned, kept him warm as long as she could. But the food ran out, and the cold just kept coming, and I wasn't there." His voice was flat now, emotionless, in the way of someone who'd told this story to himself so many times the words had lost their power to wound. "Found them frozen, still holding each other." "I'm sorry," Maggie said, knowing the words were inadequate but having nothing else to offer. "Buried them in spring when the ground thawed, on the ridge overlooking the wheat fields. Anna loved that view." Sam looked up and his pale eyes met Maggie's directly. "I stayed on the homestead because leaving would mean their deaths accomplished nothing. If I complete the 5 years, get the land title, then at least what we built together becomes permanent, becomes something that lasts after we're all gone." Maggie understood. It wasn't about the land itself or even about the wheat that grew here. It was about legacy, about making meaning from tragedy, about refusing to let death erase the work and hope and love that had been invested in this frozen patch of Montana territory. "The bookkeeping," Maggie said carefully. "When did it start falling apart?" "After Anna died. She'd kept everything organized, had a system I never learned. I tried, but I was working sunup to sundown just to keep the place running. Didn't have time to figure out her notation or cross-reference the correspondence. Just paid what people said I owed and sold when they said the price was right." Sam shook his head. "Now I know they were stealing from me the whole time, taking advantage of a widower who didn't know better." "We'll get it back," Maggie said with more confidence than she entirely felt, "or most of it anyway, and we'll make sure they can't do it to anyone else." Sam studied her for a moment. "You're not what I expected when I rode out into that storm." "What did you expect? Another woman who'd freeze because she wasn't prepared. Another body I'd have to bury come spring." He stood and collected the empty bowls. "Instead, I got someone who can see through Ben Carter's grain schemes and isn't afraid to call Hiram Colfax a thief to his face in his own bank." "I've spent my whole life being underestimated," Maggie replied, "by men who thought my height made me unfeminine, by factory owners who thought my Chinese father made me untrustworthy, by a society that thought my mother marrying outside her race made me illegitimate. I learned young that the only way to survive was to be better, smarter, more competent than anyone expected." "Well," Sam said something that might have been approval in his voice, "you're certainly that." After he left, Maggie banked the fire in the stove and prepared for bed. The narrow mattress was stuffed with straw and covered with quilts that smelled faintly of cedar from the chest where they'd been stored. She lay in the darkness, listening to the wind moving around the cabin like a living thing searching for a way inside. This was her home now, this small, rough cabin on an isolated homestead where the nearest neighbor was 40 miles away, where winter tried to kill you if you weren't constantly vigilant, where men like Hiram Colfax ran schemes that stole from people who were just trying to survive. But it was also a place where her height didn't matter, where her expertise was valued, where she could stand at her full 6 feet 2 inches and no one looked at her like she was a curiosity or a mistake. Maggie pulled the quilts closer and felt something unfamiliar settling into her bones. Not quite happiness, not yet, but possibility. The sense that here in this unlikely place she might finally build a life that belonged to her rather than fitting into spaces other people had defined. Outside, the wind howled and the temperature dropped to 30 below, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside, warm and safe, Maggie Chen slept the sleep of someone who'd found work worth doing and a purpose worth fighting for. The next morning brought the kind of bitter cold that made breathing painful and froze moisture in the air into tiny ice crystals that glittered in the weak sunlight. Maggie dressed in layers again and made her way to Sam's cabin, where she found him already preparing for a trip to Helena. "Need to pick up supplies before the next storm," he explained. "You want to come could start asking some of those careful questions you mentioned," Maggie considered. Helena meant potential access to records, meant opportunities to observe how Colfax and his associates operated, meant beginning the investigation that might eventually expose the full scope of the fraud. "Yes," she said, "I'll come." They set out an hour later, the wagon loaded with empty grain sacks that Sam planned to fill with supplies. The road to Helena was marginally better than it had been during the storm, packed down by other traffic into hard ruts that the wagon followed with bone-jarring consistency. "First stop is the Territorial Records Office," Maggie said. "I need to see business registration documents for Carter's grain operation and the transportation company." "Won't they ask why?" "I'm a newly employed accountant familiarizing myself with local business structures. Completely normal for someone in my position." Maggie pulled out a small notebook where she'd begun organizing her investigation strategy. "After that, I want to visit the grain exchange and observe how prices are posted. Then the bank to check on standard interest rates for agricultural loans." "You've thought this through," Sam observed. "Planning is half of accounting," Maggie replied. "The other half is catching people who think you won't notice the details." They reached Helena by mid-morning, and Sam drove directly to the Territorial Records Office. Inside, a clerk who looked old enough to have witnessed Montana's territorial organization sat behind a desk covered with ledgers and filing boxes. "Help you?" the clerk asked without looking up. "I need to review business registration documents," Maggie said. "Specifically for Carter Grain and Merchandise and for Mountain West Transportation Company." "You a lawyer?" "Accountant." "I'm conducting due diligence for a client considering business relationships with these entities." The clerk finally looked up his rheumy eyes, taking in Maggie's height and then her gender with equal surprise. But after a moment he simply shrugged and pulled out 2 thick folders from a filing cabinet. "Registration documents are public record," he said. "You can review them here, but nothing leaves the office." Maggie spent the next hour going through the documents with meticulous care. Carter's grain operation had been registered 8 years ago with Benjamin Carter listed as primary owner. But buried in the partnership agreements was a second name, Hiram Colfax, listed as 40% stakeholder. The transportation company showed an even more interesting ownership structure. Primary owner was listed as Marcus Webb, but the business license showed that the company had been capitalized with a loan from Colfax's bank. A loan that, according to the terms, gave the bank the right to claim majority ownership if payments fell behind by more than 90 days. Maggie copied the relevant information into her notebook, her handwriting small and precise. This was the connection she'd suspected. Colfax had partial ownership in the grain operation and effective control over the transportation company, which meant he profited at multiple points in the supply chain while homesteaders like Sam got squeezed from every direction. "Find what you needed?" the clerk asked when Maggie returned the folders. "Yes, thank you," Maggie replied. "Very illuminating." Their next stop was the grain exchange, a bustling warehouse where farmers brought their wheat for sale and where prices were posted daily based on Chicago market reports. Maggie watched the system for over an hour, noting how Carter's operation seemed to purchase wheat at times when prices were reported as low, only to ship it days later when prices had risen. The difference represented pure profit that Carter wasn't sharing with the homesteaders who'd grown the grain. She also noticed something else. Several other homesteaders' men who looked as weathered and worn as Sam delivering wheat and accepting whatever price Carter's clerk quoted without question. They had the tired resignation of people who knew they were being cheated but lacked the expertise or energy to fight back. At the bank, Maggie inquired about standard interest rates for agricultural loans and learned that Colfax was charging homesteaders 9%, while the territorial standard was 6%. Another 3% pure profit extracted from people who had no other borrowing options. By early afternoon, they had everything Maggie needed to begin building her case. They loaded the wagon with supplies and began the long drive back to the homestead. Maggie was quiet, her mind organizing the evidence she'd gathered into the structure of an argument that would eventually have to convince territorial investigators that Colfax's operation constituted fraud. "You're planning something," Sam observed. "I can tell by the way you're staring at nothing." "I'm planning how to take down a sophisticated fraud operation using nothing but publicly available records and the testimony of homesteaders who are tired of being cheated," Maggie replied. "Sounds impossible." "Difficult," Maggie corrected. "Not impossible. There's a difference." They were still 20 miles from the homestead when Maggie saw riders approaching from the east. 3 men on horseback moving with the kind of deliberate pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. Sam saw them at the same moment, and his hand moved to the rifle he kept under the wagon seat. "Trouble?" Maggie asked quietly. "Maybe," Sam replied. "Not many people have reason to be out this way." The riders drew closer, and Maggie could make out details. All 3 wore heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats. All 3 had the hard look of men accustomed to violence. The leader, a man with a scarred face and eyes the color of creek ice, pulled his horse to a stop directly in front of the wagon, forcing Sam to rein in. "Bridger," the man said. It wasn't a greeting. "Prescott," Sam replied neutrally. "Heard you've been making noise in Helena, filing complaints, stirring up trouble with men who got better things to do than answer questions about their business practices." "I've been filing legitimate grievances about documented fraud," Sam said evenly. "That's my right under territorial law." "Right or not, it's causing problems," Prescott continued. He shifted in his saddle, and his coat opened just enough to reveal a pistol holstered at his hip. "Mr. Colfax asked me to deliver a message. Stop making trouble or things get complicated." "That a threat?" Sam asked. "It's friendly advice," Prescott said, though nothing about his expression looked friendly. "Accidents happen on homesteads, fires, equipment failures. People get hurt when they're not careful." Maggie felt her heart hammering, but kept her voice steady when she said, "Threatening a territorial citizen is a criminal offense. I'm sure Sheriff Morrison would be interested to hear about this conversation." Prescott's ice-colored eyes shifted to her, and Maggie felt the weight of his assessment. "You must be the mail-order bride. Tall drink of water, ain't you?" Colfax mentioned. "You've been sticking your nose in business that don't concern you." "The business of documented fraud concerns every citizen of this territory," Maggie replied. "And I'm not a mail-order bride. I'm an accountant conducting lawful review of commercial transactions." "Accountant," Prescott repeated, making it sound like an insult. "Well, Miss Accountant, you're making some important people angry. That's a dangerous thing to do out here, where help is 40 miles away, and winter can kill you just as dead as a bullet." Sam's hand was definitely on the rifle now, though he hadn't yet pulled it into view. "You've delivered your message, Prescott. Now you can move along." For a moment Maggie thought Prescott might escalate. His 2 companions had fanned out slightly, creating angles that would make them difficult targets if shooting started. But then Prescott smiled, the expression cold as the winter wind, and said, "Just remember what I told you, Bridger. Accidents happen. Be a shame if something happened to your new accountant before she finished whatever it is she thinks she's doing." The 3 riders moved off at an unhurried pace. Sam waited until they were out of rifle range before releasing his breath in a cloud of frozen mist. "That was Dutton Prescott," he said quietly. "Colfax's enforcer, handles problems that can't be solved with lawyers. He threatened us," Maggie said, angry now that the immediate danger had passed. "Made specific threats about accidents and fires." "And we got no witnesses except ourselves," Sam replied. "Our word against his. Colfax probably made sure Prescott can account for his time today if we try to file a complaint." "So he just gets away with it." Sam urged the horses forward, the wagon resuming its journey toward the homestead. "For now. But you notice what he said? That we're making important people angry. That means what you're doing is working, means they're worried." People don't send enforcers to deliver threats unless they're afraid of what might get exposed. Maggie considered this. Sam was right. If Colfax felt secure in his schemes, he wouldn't have bothered trying to intimidate them. The fact that he'd sent Prescott meant the investigation was hitting close to something worth protecting. "We keep going," Maggie said. "But we're more careful. Document everything. Make copies of our evidence and store them somewhere Prescott can't reach them if he decides to escalate from threats to action." "There's a lawyer in Helena," Sam said. "Name's Warren. Judge Warren, though he retired from the bench 5 years back. He's honest, which is rare, and he hates Colfax, which is useful. We could give him copies of what you're building." "How do you know he's trustworthy?" "He ruled against Colfax in a land dispute case. Cost Colfax about 2,000 acres he'd been planning to claim through some legal technicality. Warren didn't care that Colfax had money and influence, just cared about what the law actually said." Sam glanced at Maggie. "Figure a man who'll stand up to Colfax in court is a man who won't turn around and sell us out." They reached the homestead as twilight was settling across the snow-covered fields. Sam helped Maggie unload her share of the supplies and carry them to her cabin. As he was leaving, he paused in the doorway. "You handled yourself well today," he said. "With Prescott. A lot of people would have backed down when a man like that makes threats." "I've spent my life dealing with men who try to make me smaller," Maggie replied. "One more bully with a gun doesn't change anything." Sam nodded slowly. "Anna used to say something similar, that the world was full of men who wanted to diminish strong women, that the trick was refusing to cooperate with your own diminishment." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked you, I think." It was perhaps the highest compliment Sam could have offered. Maggie felt something warm settle in her chest, chasing away some of the cold fear that Prescott's threats had instilled. "Thank you," she said quietly. After Sam left, Maggie spent the evening organizing her notes and making duplicate copies of the most important evidence. Business registrations showing Colfax's ownership stakes, price comparisons proving Carter's grain operation was underpaying homesteaders, loan documents showing excessive interest rates. She worked by lamplight, her hand cramping from the small, precise writing, but by midnight she had complete duplicate records that could be stored separately. The next morning, Sam drove into Helena alone, delivering the duplicate documents to Judge Warren with instructions that they be kept secure and only released if something happened to prevent Sam and Maggie from completing their investigation. When he returned that evening, he brought a letter from Warren confirming receipt and offering whatever legal assistance might be needed to ensure justice was served. "Warren said to tell you he's impressed," Sam reported. "Said in 30 years of law practice he's rarely seen fraud documented so thoroughly. Thinks we have enough to get the Territorial Attorney General involved." "When?" Maggie asked. "Soon, but he suggested we wait until we have testimony from other homesteaders. Make it clear this isn't just about my operation, but a pattern of fraud affecting multiple victims." So Maggie began the careful work of reaching out to other homesteaders, the men she'd seen at the grain exchange, accepting whatever price Carter quoted. She wrote letters introducing herself as an accountant and offering free review of their business records. She kept the tone professional and made no mention of fraud or investigation, simply offering a service that might help them better understand their financial situations. Responses came slowly. Some homesteaders ignored the letters, entirely too suspicious or too beaten down to believe help might be available. But others wrote back cautiously interested. By the end of January, Maggie had reviewed records for 4 other operations and had found the same patterns of systematic overcharging and underpayment. Each case she documented meticulously. Names, dates, specific transaction amounts. The evidence accumulated until it filled an entire ledger. Not just Sam's story, but a pattern affecting dozens of homesteaders across the territory. All of them being bled slowly by men who understood that isolated farmers had few options and less expertise to fight back. It was late February when the next threat came. Maggie was working in her cabin when she smelled smoke. Not wood smoke from the stove, but something sharper. Chemical. She opened the door to find her small pile of firewood burning with flames that shouldn't have been possible from frozen wood alone. Someone had doused it with kerosene or oil and set it ablaze. Sam appeared moments later, running from his cabin with a bucket of snow. Together they managed to douse the flames before they spread to the cabin itself, but the message was clear. Prescott, or someone working for him, had been here, had been close enough to set fire to her property while she worked inside. "You're staying in my cabin tonight," Sam said, his voice tight with anger. "And we're getting a dog, something that'll bark if anyone comes around who shouldn't be here." "We can't let them intimidate us," Maggie protested. "We're not letting them do anything," Sam replied. "But we're not being stupid either. You sleep in my cabin where I can keep watch. I'll take the small bed in the corner. Everything stays proper, but at least I'll know if someone tries this again." Maggie wanted to argue, but understood the logic. An isolated cabin made her vulnerable. Sam's presence wouldn't stop a determined attack, but it would make surprise impossible. They moved her essential belongings back to Sam's cabin that evening. He hung a blanket across the room to give her privacy and made up the small bed that had belonged to his son. The arrangement was awkward and improvised, but it felt safer than being alone when men like Prescott were willing to commit arson to deliver their warnings. Over the next weeks, they fell into a routine. Maggie worked during the day, documenting fraud and building her case. Sam prepared for spring planting, repairing equipment, and planning rotation schedules. In the evenings, they sat by the stove and talked, sharing stories of their different paths to this unlikely partnership. Maggie learned that Sam had been an Army scout before homesteading, tracking raiders through mountains, and learning to survive in conditions that killed ordinary men. Sam learned that Maggie's father had taught her to see mathematics as poetry, each equation a kind of verse that revealed truth through balance and precision. They also began to notice small things about each other. The way Sam always made sure there was coffee brewing when Maggie woke. The way Maggie had started mending Sam's shirts without being asked, her neat stitches barely visible against the worn fabric. The comfortable silences that stretched between them, neither needing to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. It was during one of these silences, both of them bent over their respective work at the table, that Sam said, without preamble, "Colfax is going to escalate. The arson was a warning, but it won't be the last thing." Maggie set down her pen. "I know. We could stop, turn over what we have to Warren, and let the Territorial Attorney General handle it from here." "Could we?" Maggie asked. "Could you really stop halfway through knowing that Colfax and Carter and all the others would keep operating? Keep stealing from people who can't fight back?" Sam was quiet for a long moment. "No," he admitted. "I couldn't." "Neither can I," Maggie said. They looked at each other across the table, the lamplight casting shadows that made Sam's face appear carved from stone. In his pale blue eyes, Maggie saw recognition of something that mirrored her own determination. They'd both lost too much, endured too many compromises and betrayals. This investigation wasn't just about money anymore. It was about refusing to let cruel men win simply because they had power and ruthlessness on their side. "All right then," Sam said finally. "We finish it. But we do it smart, and we watch each other's backs." "Agreed," Maggie said. Outside, the wind howled and the temperature plummeted, and somewhere in Helena, Hiram Colfax was almost certainly planning his next move. But inside the warm cabin, two people who'd been discarded and dismissed by a society that had no use for tall women or grieving widowers bent over their work and built something that might actually matter. They built a case. They built trust. And slowly, without either of them quite noticing when it began, they built something else too, something that felt almost like hope. March arrived with the kind of false promise that Montana winters specialized in delivering. 2 days of temperatures climbing above freezing snow, melting into mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels, followed by a storm that buried everything under 18 fresh inches and dropped the temperature back to 10 below. Sam called it the betrayal month, when spring seemed close enough to touch, but winter refused to release its grip. Maggie stood at the cabin window watching Sam work in the equipment shed, preparing the seed drill for planting season, still weeks away. He moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned that maintaining equipment in Montana required treating metal like living things that needed constant attention, or they'd fail when you needed them most. She returned to the table where her investigation had grown into something larger than she'd initially imagined. 4 ledgers, now each one documenting a different aspect of Colfax's fraud network. The first tracked his ownership stakes in supposedly independent businesses. The second detailed systematic overcharging across dozens of transactions. The third compiled testimony from 7 homesteaders who'd agreed to go on record about being cheated. The fourth, the one she'd just started, attempted to calculate total damages across all victims. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 5 years, Colfax's network had extracted an estimated $43,000 from homesteaders who could least afford it. $43,000 that should have gone into equipment livestock improvements that would have made the difference between farms that survived and farms that thrived. A knock at the door pulled her from the calculations. Sam entered carrying a letter, his expression grim. "From Judge Warren," he said, handing it to Maggie. She broke the seal and read quickly. Warren had submitted their evidence to the Territorial Attorney General's office 3 weeks ago. The response had just arrived. The Attorney General was interested, but needed more than documentation. He needed Colfax to make a mistake. Needed to catch him in an act of fraud so blatant that his lawyers couldn't explain it away as legitimate business disagreement. "They want us to bait him," Maggie said, reading between Warren's careful legal language. "Create a situation where Colfax commits fraud that can be witnessed and documented in real time." "How?" Sam asked. Maggie's mind was already working through possibilities. "He's expecting us to keep filing complaints through official channels. Keeps expecting the investigation to follow predictable legal procedures. What if we did something he didn't expect? Like what? Like approaching him directly with a business proposition," Maggie said slowly, the idea taking shape as she spoke. "Something that seems profitable enough to tempt him into showing his hand." Sam pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Explain. Your wheat harvest this year. What if we let it be known that you're planning to sell through a different buyer? Someone from Chicago who's offering better prices. Colfax will see that as a threat to Carter's operation. He'll want to undercut the offer, keep you locked into their network." "But there is no buyer from Chicago," Sam pointed out. "No," Maggie agreed. "But Colfax doesn't know that. We create fake correspondence, make it look legitimate. When Colfax or Carter comes to you trying to match or beat the offer, we document everything. Record their actual quotes, compare them to what they've been paying you. Make it impossible for them to claim they weren't deliberately underpaying." Sam considered this. "It's risky. If Colfax figures out the Chicago buyer is fake, we lose credibility. Whole investigation could fall apart." "Only if we do it poorly," Maggie replied. "But I can create documentation that will pass any inspection. Letters on proper letterhead, references to actual Chicago grain brokers, prices that align with real market rates. Make it convincing enough that Colfax has no reason to doubt it. And when he makes his counteroffer, we get it in writing, signed documentation of what he's willing to pay versus what he's been paying. That becomes evidence of deliberate fraud witnessed by both of us and documented in his own handwriting." Sam stood and paced to the stove, staring at the fire visible through the grate. Judge Warren would need to be involved, as a witness maybe, someone whose testimony in court would carry weight. "I'll write to him today," Maggie said. "Explain the plan, see if he's willing to help." Over the next week they built their trap with the same meticulous care Maggie brought to all her accounting work. She created correspondence from a fictional Chicago grain broker named Morrison & Sons, using information from actual brokers to make the letters appear legitimate. The prices she quoted were 15% above what Carter had been paying, enough to be attractive, but not so high as to seem suspicious. Judge Warren agreed to participate, suggesting he could pose as the Chicago broker's territorial representative. His legal credentials would add authenticity, and his presence would ensure that anything Colfax said or wrote could be verified by a witness whose testimony courts would accept without question. The letter to Colfax was carefully crafted. Sam wrote it himself, keeping the tone casual but letting slip that a Chicago broker had approached him with an attractive offer for his entire wheat harvest. He mentioned in passing that he was considering the proposal despite his long relationship with Carter, suggesting that business was business, and a man had to think about his own survival. The response came faster than expected. 3 days after Sam mailed the letter, a writer arrived at the homestead carrying a note from Hiram Colfax requesting a meeting to discuss wheat prices and future business arrangements. The meeting was proposed for the following Tuesday at Colfax Bank in Helena. "He's worried," Sam observed, reading the note. "Trying to sound casual, but the speed of response tells us he's concerned about losing your business." "Good," Maggie said. "Worried men make mistakes." They spent the weekend preparing. Maggie rehearsed questions she might ask, designed to get Colfax to commit to specific prices in front of Judge Warren. Sam practiced staying calm, controlling the anger that flared whenever he thought about the $380 Colfax's network had stolen from him while he struggled alone after Anna's death. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cold. They left before dawn, the wagon loaded with Maggie's ledgers and the fake correspondence from Morrison and Sons. Judge Warren met them on the road 5 miles outside Helena, riding a bay mare that looked too fine for frontier travel. "Everything ready?" Warren asked, falling in beside the wagon. "Ready as we can be," Maggie replied. "You understand the role: Chicago grain brokers representative authorized to negotiate on Morrison and Sons' behalf," Warren recited. "I've brought contracts that look legitimate enough to pass inspection. Colfax won't be able to tell their theatrical props unless he sends someone to Chicago to verify, which he won't have time to do." They reached Helena by mid-morning and went directly to the bank. Colfax was waiting in his glass-walled office, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Sam made in a good harvest year. He stood when they entered, his expression shifting from welcoming to suspicious when he saw Judge Warren. "Bridger," Colfax said, extending his hand. "Good to see you. And Miss Chen." He didn't offer to shake her hand. "I wasn't expecting additional company." "This is Judge Warren," Sam said, "representing Morrison and Sons out of Chicago. Since we're discussing significant business arrangements, I thought it appropriate to have legal counsel present." Colfax's smile tightened, but he gestured to chairs arranged around a conference table. "Of course. Always wise to have proper representation in business matters." They sat, and Colfax wasted no time. "I understand you've received an offer from a Chicago broker. I wanted to discuss that before you make any commitments. Carter and I have had a long relationship with your operation. I'd hate to see that end over a misunderstanding about pricing." "No misunderstanding," Sam said evenly. "Morrison and Sons offered me $12 per hundredweight for my wheat. That's 15% higher than what Carter paid me last harvest." "Market fluctuations," Colfax said smoothly. "Last year was difficult for everyone. Transportation costs were higher. Demand was lower in certain quarters. Carter had to adjust his prices accordingly." "According to the Chicago Board of Trade reports," Maggie interjected, pulling out one of her ledgers, "wheat prices last September were actually 8% higher than the previous year. Transportation costs on the Helena to Chicago route decreased by 3% due to new rail competition, so Carter's prices should have gone up, not down." Colfax's gaze shifted to her, and Maggie saw calculation happening behind his eyes. "Miss Chen, I'd forgotten you have an interest in market analysis." "I have an interest in accurate accounting," Maggie replied, "which requires understanding the markets that drive agricultural pricing." Judge Warren cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could discuss Morrison and Sons' current offer. I'm authorized to finalize terms today if Mr. Bridger finds them acceptable." Colfax leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "What exactly is the offer?" Warren pulled out the fake contracts. $12 per hundredweight for the entire harvest. Payment within 30 days of delivery. Transportation costs covered by Morrison and Sons. A 3-year commitment with guaranteed minimum prices regardless of market fluctuations. It was a good offer, better than good. The kind of offer that would transform Sam's operation from merely surviving to actually profitable. Maggie watched Colfax process this information, saw the moment he realized he was at risk of losing not just Sam's business, but potentially other homesteaders who might hear about Morrison and Sons and start asking why Carter wasn't offering similar terms. "I see," Colfax said slowly. "That's certainly generous, though I have to wonder about the sustainability of such terms. 3-year guarantee regardless of market conditions. That suggests either Morrison and Sons has deeper pockets than most brokers, or they're not being entirely realistic about market volatility." Morrison & Sons is one of the largest grain brokers in Chicago, Warren said, with the confidence of someone who'd actually researched the company, even though their involvement was fictional. They can absorb short-term market fluctuations in ways smaller operations cannot. Colfax was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What would it take to keep your business with Carter Bridger? I'm prepared to match the price, $12 per hundredweight, and I'll extend Carter's offer to include the same 3-year guarantee." "In writing?" Sam asked. "Of course in writing. I'll have my clerk draw up a contract this afternoon." "I'd like to see the pricing you've offered Mr. Bridger for the past 3 years," Maggie said, "to compare with current market rates and ensure the new terms represent genuine improvement." Colfax's expression went cold. "I don't see how that's relevant to current negotiations." "It's relevant if we're discussing business relationships built on trust," Maggie replied calmly. "Mr. Bridger deserves to understand whether previous pricing was fair or whether he's been systematically underpaid." "That sounds like an accusation, Miss Chen." "It's a request for transparency," Maggie said, "which any honest businessman should welcome." The tension in the room crystallized into something sharp and dangerous. Colfax stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled in the way of men who'd learned to mask anger with courtesy. "I think we're done here," Colfax said. "Mr. Bridger, if you'd like to accept Carter's offer, have your attorney contact my office. We'll draw up appropriate contracts. But I won't sit here and be accused of dishonesty by an accountant who's been in Montana less than 3 months." "No one's accusing anyone," Judge Warren interjected smoothly. "Miss Chen simply asked to review historical pricing. That's standard due diligence in any business negotiation." "Standard or not, I'm declining to provide it," Colfax replied. "My books are my business. If Bridger doesn't trust Carter's pricing, he's free to take his wheat elsewhere." He looked at Sam directly. "But understand that Carter isn't the only business relationship you have in this territory. Your equipment supplier, your seed dealer, the bank that holds your mortgage. All of those relationships exist within a network of mutual trust and cooperation. Breaking one relationship tends to affect others." It was a threat barely dressed in civilized language. Sam stood his height, requiring him to look down at Colfax, despite the banker's elevated position behind his desk. "Sounds like you're saying if I don't sell to Carter, you'll make sure no one else in Helena does business with me," Sam said flatly. "I'm saying business relationships have consequences," Colfax replied. "Good ones and bad ones. A man chooses his partners and lives with the results." "He's worried," Sam observed when the reply arrived. "Trying to sound casual, but the speed of response tells us he's concerned." They left without further conversation. Outside the bank, Judge Warren exhaled slowly. "He threatened you directly," Warren said, "in front of witnesses. That's actionable." "But not proof of fraud," Maggie replied, frustration evident in her voice. "He's too careful, knows exactly how far he can push without actually committing a prosecutable offense." "Did you notice what he didn't do?" Sam asked. They were walking toward the wagon, speaking quietly to avoid being overheard. "He didn't ask to verify Morrison & Sons, didn't request references or business credentials, just assumed the offer was real and moved to counter it." Because he couldn't afford to wait, Maggie realized. If Morrison & Sons was real and he took time to verify, he'd lose your business before he could match the offer. "Which means he's desperate," Judge Warren observed. "Desperate enough to make mistakes if we push harder." They spent the afternoon at Warren's office reviewing what they'd learned and planning next steps. The judge pulled out law books and territorial statutes, finding precedents for prosecuting business fraud when victims could demonstrate systematic deception. "The problem is documentation," Warren explained. "Colfax has been careful to keep himself separated from the actual fraud. Carter sets the grain prices. Henderson charges for seeds. The transportation company bills for shipping. Colfax just owns pieces of each operation, which isn't itself illegal." "But the pattern proves coordination," Maggie argued. "All of these businesses systematically overcharge or underpay in ways that benefit Colfax. That can't be coincidence." "Agreed," Warren said. "But proving coordination requires either internal documents showing Colfax directed the fraud or testimony from someone inside the network willing to turn against him." "Carter," Sam said suddenly. "Ben Carter. He's the one who's actually been underpaying me." if we could get him to testify against Colfax in exchange for reduced prosecution. He'd need significant motivation, Warren replied. Right now he's protected by his partnership with Colfax. We'd have to offer him something better than that protection. Maggie was already thinking through possibilities. Carter's grain operation was profitable, but not hugely so. Most of his margin came from the underpayment scheme. If that scheme was exposed, Carter would face prosecution and likely prison time. But if he cooperated, testified against Colfax, provided the internal documents that proved coordination, then perhaps the Territorial Attorney General would be willing to offer immunity. "We need leverage," Maggie said. "Something that makes Carter more afraid of prosecution than he is of Colfax." Over the next 2 weeks, they built that leverage with systematic precision. Maggie documented every transaction between Carter's grain operation and Sam's homestead, calculating the exact underpayment on each sale. She cross-referenced those numbers with Chicago Board of Trade reports, proving that Carter had access to accurate market prices and chose to ignore them when dealing with homesteaders. She also began investigating Carter's other business dealings, requesting public records of his transactions with other farmers. The pattern was consistent. Carter paid homesteaders 15 to 20% below fair market value while reporting to his Chicago contacts that he'd paid full price. The difference disappeared into profits that were split between Carter and Colfax according to their partnership agreement. The evidence filled 2 additional ledgers, not just Sam's story anymore, but a systematic fraud affecting 37 homesteaders across Montana Territory. Total damages exceeded $60,000 over a 5-year period. Enough money to represent criminal fraud on a scale that would attract attention from territorial prosecutors looking to make examples of corrupt businessmen. Judge Warren reviewed the documentation with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades evaluating evidence. When he finished, he looked at Maggie with something approaching awe. "This is extraordinary work," he said quietly. "I've prosecuted fraud cases for 20 years, and I've never seen accounting this thorough. Every claim is documented, every calculation is verified, every connection is proven with primary sources." "Will it be enough?" Maggie asked. "More than enough," Warren replied. "The Territorial Attorney General will have no choice but to prosecute once he sees this. The question is whether we offer Carter immunity in exchange for testimony or simply let the evidence speak for itself." "We offer immunity," Sam said. "Not because Carter deserves it, but because his testimony puts Colfax behind bars. Without Carter, Colfax's lawyers might convince a jury that the fraud was Carter's idea and Colfax was an innocent investor." They sent the offer through Warren, who contacted Carter's attorney with a simple proposal. Testify truthfully about Colfax's involvement in the price-fixing scheme, provide internal documents proving coordination, and the Territorial Attorney General would recommend immunity from prosecution. Refuse, and Carter would face the same criminal charges as Colfax with the same potential prison sentence. The response came 3 days later. Carter agreed to testify in exchange for full immunity and relocation assistance to leave Montana Territory after the trial. He was more afraid of Colfax's retaliation than he was of prosecution, which told Maggie everything she needed to know about how Colfax maintained control over his network. With Carter's cooperation, the case transformed from strong to overwhelming. Internal documents showed Colfax directing the price-fixing scheme through coded language in business correspondence. Ledgers proved profit-sharing arrangements that made Colfax's coordination undeniable. Carter's testimony would provide first-hand accounts of meetings where Colfax explicitly instructed him to underpay homesteaders and manipulate market reports. Judge Warren submitted everything to the Territorial Attorney General's office in late March with a cover letter explaining the scope of the fraud and the strength of the evidence. The response was swift. But 3 days before the scheduled trial disaster struck, a clerk at the Territorial Attorney General's office discovered that one of Maggie's key documents had been misfiled. The business registration showing Colfax's 40% ownership of Carter Grain was missing. Without that document, the connection between Colfax and the grain operation became circumstantial. Carter's testimony would still matter, but Colfax's lawyers could argue that Carter was a rogue partner acting independently. "We're not beaten yet," Judge Warren insisted when Maggie arrived at his office white-faced with the news. "The original is still on file in Helena. We just need to retrieve it." But when they sent a runner to the Helena Records office, they discovered something worse. The office had suffered a small fire 2 nights earlier. Minimal damage, authorities said, just some smoke and water in one filing room. The room, coincidentally, where territorial business registrations were stored. "Prescott," Sam said grimly. "Has to be. Too convenient for coincidence." Maggie stood at Warren's window, staring out at Helena's streets. After months of work, after documenting everything so carefully, they were going to lose because of fire and missing papers. "Wait," she said suddenly. "I made duplicate copies. Of everything. Remember, after Prescott threatened us the first time." Warren's face brightened. "Where are they?" "In your office," Maggie replied. "You've had them since March." Warren pulled open his filing cabinet, and there, preserved exactly as Maggie had copied them 4 months earlier, were complete duplicates of every document they needed, including the business registration showing Colfax's ownership stake. With the duplicate documents secured, the evidence was resubmitted. The Attorney General opened a formal criminal investigation, issued subpoenas for Colfax's business records, and scheduled the trial for late April. Colfax's lawyers never knew how close they'd come to escaping through burning records and bureaucratic incompetence. The Attorney General opened a formal criminal investigation, issued subpoenas for Colfax's business records, and began interviewing the 37 homesteaders who'd been identified as victims. News of the investigation spread through Helena like fire through dry grass. Maggie heard about it secondhand from a merchant who'd stopped at the homestead delivering supplies. Colfax had been questioned by territorial marshals. His bank records were being audited. Business associates were distancing themselves, claiming they'd had no knowledge of any fraudulent schemes. "People are saying you're responsible," the merchant told Maggie, his tone equal parts respectful and wary, "that you built the case that brought down Hiram Colfax." "I just documented the truth," Maggie replied. "The numbers were always there. I just made them visible." But it was more than that, and she knew it. The investigation represented months of careful work, countless hours reviewing documents and cross-referencing records and building connections that no one else had bothered to notice. It represented the expertise she'd spent years developing, the skills her father had taught her when he insisted that mathematics was the only truly objective measure of truth in a world full of subjective opinions. The Territorial Attorney General scheduled Colfax's trial for late April, giving prosecutors time to prepare the case using Maggie's documentation as their primary evidence. Judge Warren would testify about the attempted intimidation at the bank. Carter would provide insider testimony about Colfax's directives. And Maggie would present the financial evidence, walking the jury through the systematic fraud in language clear enough that men with no accounting background could understand how they'd been cheated. It was during the second week of April, with spring finally asserting itself over winter's resistance, that Maggie walked out to find Sam working in the field that would soon be planted with wheat. He was testing soil moisture, running the dark earth through his fingers with the focused attention of someone whose survival depended on reading subtle signs correctly. "Ready for planting?" Maggie asked, coming to stand beside him. "Another week," Sam replied. "Ground needs to warm up just a bit more. But yes, almost ready." They stood in silence for a moment, looking out over the 160 acres that Sam had fought so hard to keep. The land that had cost him his wife and son, but which represented the only permanence he had left in a world that took more than it gave. "After the trial," Sam said without looking at her, "what will you do?" It was a question Maggie had been avoiding asking herself. The investigation was nearly complete. The trial would be over by May. Her original employment agreement had been month to month, with no long-term commitment on either side. She could return to Boston, use the money she'd saved to restart her life, in a city where she at least understood the social structures, even if she'd never fit comfortably into them. But Boston held nothing for her anymore. The factory was still closed, her mother was still dead, the boarding houses and tenements still full of people who looked at her height and her heritage as things to be explained or overcome rather than simply accepted as facts of her existence. "I don't know," Maggie admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "Well," Sam said, finally turning to look at her directly, "I have." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. The craftsmanship was exceptional, the wood polished until it gleamed, and the corners joined with the precision of someone who understood how pieces needed to fit together to create something lasting. "Made this last week," Sam said, opening the box to reveal a ring inside. Not gold or silver, but carved from wood with a band of inlaid copper that caught the afternoon light. Copper from a mine near Butte, wood from the ridge where Anna and Jesse are buried. Figure if I'm asking someone to share my life, the ring should represent the place where that life happens. Maggie's heart was beating very fast. "Sam, let me finish," he said quietly. "I know this isn't what you came to Montana for. I know you signed on as an accountant, not a wife. But these past months, working beside you, watching you fight for something bigger than just yourself, I've realized something I thought I'd never feel again." He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to what he was trying to express. "When Anna died, I thought I was done. Thought the best I could manage was surviving until the homestead proved up, and then maybe just existing until it was my turn to be buried on that ridge. But you came into my life like a storm, refused to accept the way things were, tore apart, corruption that everyone else had learned to live with. You reminded me what it feels like to build something instead of just enduring." Sam held out the ring, his large calloused hand surprisingly steady. "Maggie Chen, I'm asking if you'll marry me, not because protocol demands it, not because it's convenient or expected, but because when I think about the future, about the next 5 years or 20 years or however long I get, you're in every version I can imagine. Because partnership in bookkeeping isn't enough anymore. I want partnership in everything." Maggie looked at the ring, at the care evident in its construction, at the symbolism of using materials from the land and the graves and the history that had brought them both to this moment. She thought about the small cabin that had become her home, about the work that had given her purpose, about the man who'd saved her life and then given her space to save his in return. "Yes," she said, surprised by how easy the word came. "Yes, I'll marry you." Sam's smile transformed his face, erasing years of grief and loneliness in an instant. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, the wood warm against her skin, the copper band gleaming. "Should probably kiss you now," Sam observed. "Seems like the thing to do when a woman accepts a proposal." "Probably should," Maggie agreed. He leaned down, she lifted her face up, and for the first time in her life, a kiss didn't require her to bend or accommodate or make herself smaller. They were matched. Complementary heights that fit together as naturally as the wooden ring fit her finger. They were married 3 days later by Judge Warren in a simple ceremony at the homestead with only the judge and his wife as witnesses. Maggie wore her best dress, the navy wool she'd sewn herself, and Sam wore the only suit he owned, brushed clean and mended, where moths had found the fabric during years of storage. The vows were traditional, to have and to hold, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. But when Sam slipped a second ring onto Maggie's finger alongside the wooden one, this one made of plain gold that had belonged to his mother, she understood that the vows meant more than just words. They meant choosing partnership over isolation, choosing to build together rather than merely survive separately. That night, they consummated the marriage in the cabin that had been Sam's and was now theirs. Maggie had worried it might feel strange sharing space with the ghosts of Anna and Jesse. But Sam had changed things, moved the small bed out to storage, replaced it with shelves for Maggie's growing collection of ledgers and documents, made room for her presence in ways that honored the past without being trapped by it. In the darkness, lying beside the man who was now her husband, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death. Belonging. Not the conditional belonging of people who accepted her despite her height or her heritage, but the absolute belonging of someone who was chosen exactly as she was, with no requirements to diminish or apologize or explain herself. "What are you thinking?" Sam asked, his voice quiet in the darkness. "That I came to Montana expecting to marry a banker, and instead I married a homesteader," Maggie replied, "and that this is infinitely better." "Better than a banker," Sam's tone held gentle humor. "That's not saying much." "Better than anything I imagined for myself," Maggie clarified. "Better than I thought I deserved." Sam pulled her closer, his large frame warm against her back. "You deserve everything, Maggie Bridger, And I plan to spend however long I get making sure you know that. Maggie Bridger. The name felt right. Felt like claiming space in the world rather than apologizing for occupying it. The trial began on April 23rd in the Territorial Courthouse in Helena. The prosecution called Maggie as their primary witness, asking her to walk the jury through the evidence she'd compiled. For 3 hours, she explained the accounting using visual aids and simplified language to make complex fraud comprehensible to men who'd never balanced a ledger. She showed them how Colfax owned pieces of businesses that claimed to be independent, demonstrated how those businesses systematically cheated homesteaders through coordinated pricing schemes, calculated total damages, and explained how the stolen money had flowed through Colfax's network and eventually into his personal accounts. The jury, 12 men ranging in age from 30 to 60, listened with increasing attention. Several took notes. Others simply stared at the charts and documents Maggie presented, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding to anger as they realized the scope of what had been done. Carter testified next, providing insider details that confirmed everything Maggie's accounting had revealed. He described meetings where Colfax explicitly directed the price fixing, produced letters where Colfax instructed him to manipulate market reports, admitted that he'd participated in fraud but claimed he'd done so under Colfax's direction and control. The defense tried to discredit Carter as a criminal trying to save himself by blaming his partner. But Judge Warren's testimony about Colfax's threats at the bank undermined that strategy. Then the prosecution called 3 other homesteaders who described similar experiences of being systematically underpaid and overcharged by businesses Colfax controlled. The pattern was undeniable, the evidence overwhelming. After 4 days of testimony and 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all 17 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and theft. Judge Wilson, presiding over the case, sentenced Colfax to 12 years in territorial prison and ordered restitution of $63,000 to be distributed among the victims. Colfax's business assets would be liquidated to pay the restitution, effectively destroying the network he'd spent years building. Maggie watched from the gallery as Colfax was led away in chains. He didn't look at her or Sam or any of the homesteaders who'd come to witness his conviction, just stared straight ahead with the blank expression of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed in the span of 4 days. Outside the courthouse, homesteaders approached Maggie and Sam with gratitude that was almost overwhelming. Men who'd lost hundreds of dollars to Colfax's schemes shook her hand and thanked her for caring enough to fight back. Women whose families had struggled while Colfax profited hugged her and called her a hero. "Not a hero," Maggie protested. "Just an accountant doing her job." "You did more than a job," one farmer's wife insisted. "You gave us justice when everyone else said we just had to accept how things were." That night, back at the homestead, Sam and Maggie sat on the porch watching the sunset over fields that would soon be green with growing wheat. The restitution money, when it finally came through, would transform the operation. New equipment, irrigation systems, reserves for bad years. Everything Sam had needed but couldn't afford while Colfax was stealing his profits. "We did it," Sam said quietly. "You did most of it," Maggie replied. "I just organized the evidence." "You did everything that mattered," Sam corrected. "I saved you from freezing in a blizzard. You saved 37 families from financial ruin. Think you got the better end of that bargain." Maggie leaned against his shoulder at peace in the quiet that stretched between them. In the distance, she could hear the first meadowlarks of spring, their songs carrying across the still frozen earth like promises that winter would eventually end. 1 year later, Maggie sat in the same spot on the porch, but now she held a baby in her arms. Sarah Chen Bridger, born in early May during a thunderstorm that had Sam pacing anxiously while the midwife from Helena delivered their daughter with practiced efficiency. Sarah had Sam's pale blue eyes and what would likely become Maggie's height given the length of her infant limbs. She was perfect, impossibly small and fragile and perfect. "How's my girls?" Sam asked, coming out of the barn where he'd been tending to a mare about to foal. "Your girls are excellent," Maggie replied. though I think Sarah might need changing soon." Sam took the baby, gently handling her with the careful competence he brought to everything from equipment repair to marriage. He'd been afraid at first, terrified that fatherhood would resurrect memories of Jessie too painful to bear. But Sarah was her own person, demanding attention and care in ways that created new memories rather than merely echoing old ones. The homestead had transformed over the past year. New irrigation channels carried water to 52 acres of wheat that grew taller and healthier than anything Sam had managed in previous years. A new seed drill sat in the equipment shed alongside the old one, kept as backup. The cabin had been expanded, adding 2 rooms that would eventually hold the children Maggie and Sam planned to have. Maggie had expanded too, opening Chen Bridger Agricultural Accounting, a service that provided bookkeeping and financial management to homesteaders across Montana Territory. She had 12 clients now, all of them paying fair rates for expertise that helped them avoid the kind of fraud that had nearly destroyed Sam's operation. The business operated from a small office they'd built adjacent to the main cabin, with filing cabinets full of ledgers and correspondence that documented the growing agricultural economy of a territory transforming itself into what would eventually become a state. Judge Warren stopped by once a month to review legal questions and have dinner with them. He'd become something between a friend and a father figure, the older man who'd helped them navigate the legal complexities of bringing down Colfax, and who now delighted in playing grandfather to Sarah. "She's going to be tall," Warren observed during one visit, watching Sarah grab at his finger with surprising strength, "probably taller than her mother." "Good," Maggie said firmly. "The world needs more tall women who refuse to apologize for taking up space." 10 years later, Maggie stood in that same office watching her 4 children play in the yard outside. Sarah, at 10, was indeed tall, already approaching 5.5 feet and showing signs she'd eventually match or exceed Maggie's height. Sam Jr. at 7 had his father's build and his mother's head for numbers. Anna at 5 was small and fierce, named for the woman who'd built this homestead before Maggie arrived. Jessie at 2 was chaos incarnate, destroying everything within reach with the cheerful determination of a tornado. The homestead now covered 320 acres, purchased with profits from wheat sales that had been honest and fair since Colfax's network collapsed. Sam employed 8 workers during harvest season and had built a reputation as one of the most successful agricultural operations in the territory. Maggie's accounting business had grown correspondingly. She now served 43 homesteads, helping manage everything from tax preparation to equipment purchasing to market analysis. Several of her clients had become successful enough to expand their own operations, creating a network of prosperous farms that had transformed the economic landscape of this part of Montana. She'd also written a book, Homestead Accounting Manual, that was being used by farmers across the Western Territories. The book explained basic bookkeeping principles in language accessible to men who'd never had formal education, but who needed to understand numbers to survive. It had sold 3,000 copies in its first year and was being reprinted to meet continuing demand. "Mother," Sarah called from the yard, "Jessie's trying to eat dirt again." Maggie smiled and set down her pen. Some things never changed. Children needed supervision. Farms required constant work. Husbands needed reminding to come in from the fields before dark. Life continued in its messy, demanding, beautiful complexity. 20 years later, on their anniversary, Sam and Maggie sat on the porch watching the sun set over land they'd built together. Sam was 62 now, his hair completely gray, but his strength undiminished by age. Maggie was 48, her accounting expertise recognized throughout Montana, which had finally achieved statehood 3 years earlier. Their children were grown. Sarah had married a school teacher and moved to Missoula, where she taught mathematics at the new state university. Sam Jr. ran the homestead, now expanding it to 640 acres with irrigation systems that used water from 3 different creeks. Anna had become a lawyer, inspired by Judge Warren, who died 2 years earlier at age 86. Jessie was studying agricultural science in Bozeman, planning to return and implement new farming techniques. "We built something," Sam said quietly, watching the light fade across fields green with wheat. "We did," Maggie agreed. More than I thought possible that day I pulled you out of the blizzard. Maggie looked at her husband, seeing the man who'd saved her life in more ways than just physical rescue, who'd given her work that mattered and space to be herself, and partnership that required no diminishment. More than I thought possible when I stepped off that train expecting to marry a banker, she replied. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house they could hear their grandchildren playing, brought by Sarah for the anniversary celebration. The next generation already making noise and demanding space and carrying forward the legacy that Maggie and Sam had built from nothing but stubborn determination and the willingness to fight for justice even when it seemed impossible. Sam died peacefully at age 82, sitting in his favorite chair on the porch overlooking the wheat fields he'd cultivated for nearly 6 decades. Maggie found him there in the morning, his face calm and his hand still holding the book he'd been reading. They buried him on the ridge beside Anna and Jesse, 3 graves that told the story of love and loss and the resilience required to survive Montana's harsh beauty. Sam died on a Tuesday in late September, the kind of perfect autumn day he'd always loved best. The wheat had been harvested, the equipment stored for winter, everything in order, the way he'd lived his entire life. Maggie found him in his chair on the porch, the book he'd been reading still open on his lap. For a moment she thought he was sleeping, the afternoon sun warm on his face, his expression peaceful. Then she saw the absolute stillness of his chest and understood. She sat beside him for a long time, holding his cooling hand, watching the sun move across fields they'd cultivated together for 40 years. The grief was enormous, but not surprising. They'd both known this day would come, had talked about it with the same practical honesty they'd brought to everything else in their marriage. "You stayed long enough to see the harvest in," she told him quietly. "That's very like you, Sam Bridger, always making sure the work was finished before you rested." She thought about the man who'd ridden into a blizzard to save a stranger, who'd offered employment when he could have offered pity, who'd built a partnership based on respect rather than romance, though romance had come eventually, deep and abiding and real. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for standing beside me, for 40 years of choosing partnership every single day." The sun set over the ridge where they would bury him tomorrow beside Anna and Jesse. 3 graves marking the journey of a man who'd loved deeply, lost terribly, and found the courage to love again. Maggie sat with her husband's body until darkness fell, completely, the stars emerging one by one in the vast Montana sky. Then she stood, kissed his forehead one final time, and went to tell their children that their father had gone home. Maggie lived another 5 years, long enough to see her great-grandchildren, and long enough to watch Montana transform from frontier territory to modern state. She died in her sleep at age 73. Her ledgers and documents donated to the Montana Historical Society, where they became primary sources for historians studying territorial economics and the fight against frontier corruption. Her funeral drew over 200 people, homesteaders whose families she'd helped, students who'd learned accounting from her manual, lawyers who cited her fraud case as precedent, all of them gathering to honor a woman who'd arrived in Montana with 43 cents and built an empire of integrity. They buried her beside Sam, on the ridge, her gravestone simple but accurate, Margaret Chen Bridger. Accountant, homesteader, mother of Montana. In 2024, the homestead still operates. James Bridger, 5th-generation descendant, farms 1,200 acres using techniques that would amaze his great-great-great-grandmother, but which rest on principles she established. Sustainable cultivation, fair dealing, honest accounting. The things that matter don't change, only the tools used to implement them. Maggie's original ledgers are displayed at the Montana Historical Society, her precise handwriting still legible after 140 years. Visitors can see the evidence she compiled against Colfax, the documentation that brought down a corrupt network and established precedent for prosecuting business fraud in the American West. But the real legacy isn't in museums or history books. It's in the land itself, in the 1,200 acres that 5 generations have cultivated, in the Chen Bridger agricultural accounting firm that still operates in Billings, providing services to modern farms, In the tall women who stand at their full height and refuse to apologize because Margaret Chen Bridger proved you could be 6 feet 2 inches and still change the world. The numbers never lied. They just needed someone brave enough to make them tell the truth. Maggie was that person, and her truth echoed across more than a century, reminding everyone who listened that justice was possible if you were willing to do the math.